Jessica Williams adjusted her faded denim jacket as she walked through the bustling streets of San Francisco's financial district. At 35, she had long abandoned the notion that wealth could be measured by appearances. She was comfortable in her own skin, and today that meant a simple outfit, her go-to jeans, a soft blouse, and the jacket that had seen better days but still held sentimental value. It wasn't the first time she had felt out of place in the world of high society, but today was different. It was their fifth anniversary, and instead of their usual anniversary dinner at the renowned Lumiere restaurant overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge, Nicholas had chosen something new. Lumiere's newest location in the heart of downtown, a modern space designed to impress, with glass walls reflecting the city's skyline and interior decor that screamed luxury. Jessica had never been to this new spot before, but she trusted Nicholas's taste. After all, he had a knack for choosing the perfect places, even though his idea of a perfect night involved a business deal more often than not. She checked her watch. It was 5:15 p.m. Nicholas wouldn't arrive for another 2 hours, so Jessica decided to arrive early. She wanted everything to be perfect, a quiet prelude to the evening of celebration. She loved the tradition they had built over the years, the city tours, the laughter, the shared memories. But something about tonight felt different. Maybe it was the sleek, intimidating exterior of Lumiere's new location, or the sense of unfamiliarity that hung in the air. Whatever it was, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that this anniversary, while special, would be marked by more than just good food and good company. Jessica stepped into the lobby of Lumiere, the polished floors gleaming beneath her shoes as she glanced around at the impressive surroundings. The space was modern, almost too pristine. Glass walls, minimalist sculptures, and ambient lighting that seemed designed to make every detail feel like it belonged to another world. A world she wasn't sure she fit into. Her eyes wandered to the hostess stand, where a blonde woman with a perfectly poised smile stood waiting. "Good evening. How may I assist you?" the hostess asked, her eyes quickly scanning Jessica from head to toe. "I have a reservation," Jessica said, her voice steady despite the subtle discomfort she felt under the woman's scrutinizing gaze. "Under Morrison, Nicholas Morrison." For 7 o'clock, the hostess's eyes flickered to the tablet in front of her fingers swiping across the screen as she scanned for the name. She paused, her eyebrows arching slightly when she found the reservation. "That reservation is for 7 p.m., the hostess said, her tone somewhat dismissive. "It's only 5:15. I know you're early, but perhaps you'd prefer to wait elsewhere, like the cafe down the street?" Jessica hesitated. The woman's suggestion felt more like an insult than an offer, but she smiled politely. "I'll wait here, thank you." The hostess's smile remained fixed, though her eyes were less warm. "Of course," she said, motioning vaguely toward a small, isolated table near the kitchen. It was tucked away from the prime seating areas, clearly meant for someone who wasn't quite deserving of the restaurant's best view. Jessica nodded and walked past, her mind briefly flashing back to all the times she had felt like an outsider in the world of wealth and status. But she had learned long ago to hold her head high, and tonight would be no different. Jessica sat down at the small table near the kitchen, her back straight as she surveyed the room around her. The restaurant was still buzzing with activity, though most patrons hadn't arrived yet. Staff members moved swiftly between tables, arranging flowers, polishing glasses, and setting up for the night ahead. Despite the growing crowd, the table she was assigned felt isolated, almost intentionally so. Her fingers drummed lightly on the table, a quiet rhythm that helped her manage the restlessness building in her chest. As she glanced around, she could see the waitstaff exchanging glances, murmuring to one another in hushed tones. The subtle mockery was palpable, though no one had directly addressed her yet. She could almost feel the dismissive stares from across the room, their judgmental glances barely concealed as they saw her sitting there in her denim jacket while they prepared for the evening's lavish service. Jessica reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, scrolling through pictures of her and Nicholas from past anniversaries. It wasn't the first time she had felt out of place in a high-end setting, but tonight felt particularly harsh. Perhaps it was because this was new, the new restaurant, the new dynamic. The familiar sense of comfort, of being by Nicholas's side in this world of wealth, was momentarily missing. Her thoughts were interrupted when Marcus, one of the waiters, approached her table. His face held a polite but rehearsed smile, a smile she had seen too many times in places like this, worn by people who only pretended to care. "Can I get you something while you wait?" he asked, his tone almost too sweet to be sincere. Jessica met his gaze, her expression neutral. "A gin and tonic would be nice," she replied, keeping her voice level. Marcus's eyebrows raised slightly, his surprise at her request evident before he masked it with a forced smile. "Of course," he said, his voice just a shade too cold to be genuine. "I'll be right back with that." As Marcus walked away, Jessica couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in the energy around her. The staff had resumed their quiet conversations, but now their laughter was less hidden, more audible. She caught snippets of whispered remarks, laughs that didn't bother to hide their judgment. The young waiter with copper hair snickered as he passed by, his gaze lingering on Jessica's casual outfit. She knew exactly what they were thinking. She doesn't belong here. It wasn't the first time she'd faced this kind of treatment, but something about tonight made the dismissive attitude sting more. Perhaps it was the isolation of being alone in a luxury restaurant that still wasn't open to the public. Or perhaps it was the feeling that she was being sized up, judged not for who she was, but for what she represented. Or rather, what they thought she represented. A few minutes later, Marcus returned with her drink, setting it down on the table with a hint of disdain. The gin and tonic was lukewarm and weak, a clear reflection of his attitude. "Compliments of the bar," he said, though Jessica could see that the bartender had made the drink and left it sitting for far too long. She took a sip, the bitter taste of watered-down gin not masking the frustration that had begun to build inside her. "Thank you," she said coolly, not bothering to comment on the quality of the drink. Her thoughts were already elsewhere, but her calm exterior remained. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her discomfort. Jessica sat back in her chair, scanning the room again. The staff continued to move about, polishing silverware and adjusting the fine china with practiced precision. She noticed a few patrons had begun to trickle in, dressed in elegant attire, their conversations already filling the space with the hum of wealth and high society. And then there was her, alone at a table near the kitchen, her denim jacket, jeans, and simple blouse standing in stark contrast to the polished perfection around her. She sighed softly, her fingers grazing the edge of her glass. The gin and tonic, though weak, was a small comfort in this sea of unfamiliar faces. But she couldn't shake the feeling that everyone in the room was either judging her or talking about her. It was something she had experienced before, at charity galas, fundraisers, and other events where her husband's success made her a fixture, even if she never quite felt at home in those circles. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "Everything all right, ma'am?" The young man from earlier, Marcus, appeared again, this time with a more direct approach. His smile was still stiff, his eyes glinting with the same thinly veiled condescension he had shown before. "Can I get you something else while you wait?" Jessica looked up at him, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I'm fine, thank you," she said, her tone steady. She could sense his amusement, but she wasn't going to let him see how his behavior affected her. She had more important things to focus on, like what she planned to do when Nicholas finally arrived. Marcus gave a polite nod and walked away, but Jessica could still feel his gaze lingering for a moment longer than necessary. The staff's attention was turning more overt now, the whispers between them growing louder, the amusement less subtle. She saw Claire, the blonde hostess, pass by, her eyes scanning Jessica's outfit before turning away, with an almost imperceptible shake of her head. The copper-haired waiter also cast a glance in her direction as he moved past, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. Jessica kept her composure, but the quiet mockery stung. She had spent years in this world of wealth, knowing all too well the unspoken rules and the way people judge based on appearances. Her clothes didn't fit the image of the elite, but she had learned long ago that appearances were often deceiving. Yet here, in this moment, the sharp contrast between her casual look and their perfect facades felt glaring. Just as she began to settle back into her thoughts, a new face appeared. An older man, tall with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses. His name tag read Edward Winters, the general manager by the looks of it, and he was walking straight toward her, his expression a mix of concern and calculation. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice polite but careful. "I'm Edward Winters, the general manager. I understand you're waiting for someone?" Jessica met his eyes calmly. "Yes, my husband, Nicholas Morrison. He'll be here at 7. Edward paused, his gaze flicking over her, clearly weighing her appearance against the information she had just provided. "Of course," he said, but there was something in his tone, something questioning, as if he wasn't quite sure he believed her. Jessica sat at the small table, the unease settling deeper in her chest as the minutes ticked by. The staff's whispers became more frequent, their eyes constantly darting toward her. She could hear the occasional snicker, and though they tried to be discreet, it was impossible to ignore the palpable judgment. It was clear they were waiting for her to either prove her worth or make a spectacle of herself. Neither was something she was willing to give them. She focused on her breathing, attempting to block out the noise around her. She had endured worse than this, much worse. Being from a small town in the Midwest, where people's worth was measured by character and not by designer labels, had taught her resilience. But tonight felt different. Tonight she was alone in a world that wasn't her own, surrounded by a crowd that didn't seem to want her there. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, a smile tugging at her lips when she saw the name. Nicholas. "Wrapping up now. Can't wait to see you. Happy anniversary, my love." Jessica's heart fluttered at the text. She quickly typed back, a small grin forming as she read her reply before hitting send. "I'm already here. Table by the kitchen. You can't miss me. I'm the one in the scandalous denim jacket." Her phone buzzed again, and this time his response came almost immediately. "My rebel bride. See you soon." Her smile lingered a little longer as she placed the phone back in her bag, but the moment was fleeting. The attention on her didn't stop, and she could feel the pressure mounting. The weight of judgment from strangers was one thing, but the discomfort of being seen as an outsider in a space she didn't belong was another. As Jessica put her phone away, the restaurant's atmosphere seemed to shift subtly around her. The staff's whispered conversations grew quieter, but their stares remained. They had all seen her text exchange, and now she could almost feel their eyes on her like a spotlight. Edward, the general manager, appeared again, walking toward her with an expression that was a little too rehearsed to be sincere. His eyes flickered toward the empty chair across from her, clearly uncomfortable with her presence. He cleared his throat before speaking, his tone polite but strained. "Mrs. Morrison, I trust everything is to your satisfaction?" His question felt more like an attempt to cover up his previous doubts, though he seemed genuine in his desire to make things right. "I'm fine, thank you," Jessica replied coolly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. She wasn't going to let him see how their behavior had affected her. She had learned long ago to hide her discomfort, especially in places like this. Edward hesitated for a moment, seemingly unsure of how to proceed. "If you need anything while you wait, please don't hesitate to let us know." His attempt at kindness fell flat, but Jessica appreciated the effort to make amends. She nodded, smiling politely, but the truth was she didn't need anything from him. What she needed was to be left alone until Nicholas arrived. As the minutes ticked by, the restaurant slowly filled with diners, and the ambient noise grew louder. Jessica couldn't help but feel even more out of place. Here she was, sitting in a restaurant where she clearly wasn't welcomed, her husband's wealth and reputation looming over her like a silent, invisible shield. And yet, despite the discomfort, Jessica refused to let it define her. She would not let their assumptions change who she was. Jessica's patience was beginning to wear thin. The subtle snickers had turned into open stares, and the murmurs around her had grown louder, more pronounced. She could feel the heat of their judgment burning through her, but she remained still, her gaze fixed on the entrance, waiting for Nicholas. She knew that the moment he arrived, the dynamic would shift. She'd no longer be the invisible, unimportant woman at the edge of the room. But that didn't make the waiting any easier. A few more minutes passed, and Jessica's thoughts drifted to the many times she had been an outsider in her life. Growing up in the Midwest, she had never fit into the mold of what others expected. She had been different, less polished, less concerned with appearances, more focused on doing what felt right. And it had taken her years to find someone who understood that about her, who valued her authenticity above everything else. Her phone buzzed again, breaking her reverie. Another message from Nicholas. Still on my way? Almost there, love. Don't let them get to you. The familiar words brought a small smile to her lips. He always knew how to calm her down, even when he wasn't there. She typed back, I'm fine. They're just testing me. She hit send and leaned back in her chair, trying to steady the unease in her chest. It was moments like these, moments when she was judged for her simple, unpretentious self, that made her more grateful for Nicholas. He had always seen her for who she was, not for the world's perception of her. As Jessica sat quietly, the air in the restaurant seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. The staff continued their rounds, but their attention was now more direct, more pointed. Every glance, every movement felt like they were scrutinizing her, waiting for her to crack under the pressure. She could hear snippets of conversation from nearby tables, some of it no doubt about her, though she couldn't make out the words clearly. Still, the implication was clear. She was different. She didn't belong here. The noise around her was a stark contrast to the silence that had settled in her mind. Her thoughts circled back to her and Nicholas's early days together. When they first met, she had been working as a children's book illustrator, barely getting by. He had come to one of her book signings offering a donation to the literacy program she was working with. He hadn't been trying to impress her with his wealth. He had simply wanted to know her. She remembered how surprised she had been by his genuine interest in her work, and how it made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't so out of place in this world of privilege. And now here she was, still holding on to the same values that had made her fall for Nicholas in the first place. She hadn't changed. No matter how much wealth surrounded her, she still wore the same clothes, still drove her old Volvo, still cherished the simple things that brought her joy. She wasn't about to let a room full of strangers make her feel small for that. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a message from Nicholas. It was a call. She looked at the screen and saw that it was an unknown number. She let it ring, refusing to let anything distract her now. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling longer than the last. Jessica sat quietly, her gaze fixed on the kitchen doors just beyond her table. Though her mind was far from the bustling restaurant around her, the whispers and sidelong glances from the staff were growing more overt, and she could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. She knew what they were thinking. She doesn't belong here. It wasn't the first time she'd encountered this kind of treatment, but tonight it felt sharper. It wasn't just about her clothes, it was about everything she represented. As she sat there, a new thought began to surface. She had always known that her life with Nicholas had placed her in a world where appearances mattered. He was one of the wealthiest financiers in the city, and she was his wife. People looked at her and saw a life of luxury, status, and privilege, but few ever stopped to see the real her. The woman who still held on to her Midwest roots, who didn't care about designer labels, who would rather spend her Saturday at a farmer's market than at an exclusive boutique. The staff wasn't the only group judging her tonight. As the restaurant filled up, Jessica noticed a few of the patrons eyeing her with the same curiosity. A woman in an elegant Chanel suit whispered to her companion, her eyes flicking toward Jessica. The conversation was too quiet for her to catch the words, but the looks were enough. The woman's disapproving stare lingered longer than necessary before she turned away. Jessica took a deep breath, trying to center herself. She wasn't going to let their assumptions define her. Not tonight, not ever. Just as Jessica steadied her breath, the door to the kitchen swung open, and a familiar face emerged. It was Marcus, the waiter who had been so dismissive earlier. He was walking toward her, but this time his posture was slightly different, more rigid, as if he were trying to be extra professional. "Is everything all right?" Marcus asked, his voice laced with a bit more concern than before. Jessica looked up at him, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied coolly, though she could feel her patience starting to thin. There was a moment of silence before Marcus spoke again. "Would you like anything else? A menu, perhaps?" He seemed to be making an effort to correct his previous behavior, but it didn't go unnoticed by Jessica. His politeness felt forced, like an afterthought. "No, thank you," she said, her voice calm but firm. She wasn't interested in any further conversation. She just wanted to sit and wait for Nicholas, to have the evening they'd planned without the shadow of mockery hanging over her. As Marcus turned to leave, Jessica couldn't help but notice the way a few of the other staff members looked at her. Their expressions had shifted from quiet judgment to something more curious. It was subtle, but it was there. The whispers had died down, and now they were simply watching her. She had no idea what had caused the shift, but she could feel it in the air. Something was about to change. As Jessica sat quietly at her table, a sense of unease began to wash over her again. The whispers had slowed, but the uncomfortable stares continued. She tried to focus on her phone, scrolling aimlessly through old photos of her and Nicholas, the memories of their simpler, happier times. But just as she started to settle into the calmness those images provided, something caught her eye. Vanessa, the blonde hostess, was walking toward her with a middle-aged couple in tow. The couple was dressed in impeccable evening attire, and Jessica could see the look of confusion on their faces as they approached. She recognized the man as a regular at Lumiere, someone who frequently dined at the restaurant's prestigious locations, always well-dressed, always at ease in this world of wealth. But it wasn't just the couple that caught Jessica's attention. It was the way Vanessa looked at her, briefly but pointedly, before escorting the couple to a prime table by the window. Jessica knew exactly what was happening. The staff had already assigned the best table to someone else, but this new couple, dressed in designer labels and clearly fitting the image of Lumiere's clientele, were being treated with the respect she hadn't been afforded. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice, one that she immediately recognized as Mrs. Abernathy's, a philanthropist and chairwoman of the Children's Literacy Foundation, where Jessica had first met Nicholas. The elderly woman had always been kind to her, treating her as an equal despite the difference in their social circles. "Jessica, is that you?" Mrs. Abernathy asked, her warm voice cutting through the tension in the air. Jessica looked up, a smile forming on her face as she saw the familiar face. Jessica's heart skipped a beat as she stood to greet Mrs. Abernathy. The woman was elegant as always, draped in a navy dress and a pearl necklace that seemed to glow in the restaurant's soft light. Her presence felt like a breath of fresh air in the otherwise stifling atmosphere of judgment. "Mrs. Abernathy," Jessica said warmly, extending her hand. "It's so lovely to see you." The older woman smiled, her eyes sparkling with recognition. "Jessica, dear, I didn't realize you were dining here tonight. How lovely to see you." She paused, then glanced around, her gaze falling on Jessica's seat near the kitchen. "What is going on here? Why are you sitting back here all alone?" Before Jessica could respond, Mrs. Abernathy turned to the manager, who had appeared nearby. "Edward," she said, addressing him with a note of authority that immediately made the man stand a little straighter. "I trust you are taking good care of Jessica? She and her husband, Nicholas, have been some of our most generous benefactors." Edward's face paled, and for a moment, he was speechless. It seemed he hadn't recognized Jessica for who she truly was, despite her husband's influence. "Mrs. Abernathy, I wasn't aware she was here tonight," he stammered, clearly flustered. The older woman raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by his excuse. "Well, now you know, and I expect you to ensure she's treated with the utmost respect while she's here. She's one of the most talented illustrators I've had the privilege to work with." Jessica felt a wave of gratitude for Mrs. Abernathy's unexpected intervention, but it didn't completely erase the sting of the earlier treatment. However, her presence had changed the dynamic. The manager's posture immediately shifted from uncomfortable to apologetic. "I'll make sure everything is taken care of right away," Edward said, his voice tinged with nervousness. Jessica smiled at Mrs. Abernathy, who gave her a knowing look. "Thank you," Jessica replied quietly. "How are the children's programs doing?" Mrs. Abernathy beamed, clearly pleased to talk about the foundation. "Thanks to generous donors like you and Nicholas, we are thriving. Your contributions have made a huge impact, Jessica." As they chatted, Jessica felt the weight of the previous tension lift slightly. It was a brief but welcome moment of solidarity, and just as quickly, the restaurant staff seemed to take note of the shift. They may not have recognized her at first, but with Mrs. Abernathy's endorsement, it was clear they could no longer pretend she was simply an outsider. Jessica's pulse quickened as she watched Edward retreat toward the staff station, his demeanor completely transformed after Mrs. Abernathy's intervention. The whispers among the waitstaff had all but stopped, and the uncomfortable glances that once followed her every movement had shifted to nervous glances, as if they were suddenly unsure of what to do with her presence. It wasn't just Mrs. Abernathy's recognition of Jessica's importance, it was the sudden shift in power dynamics. The manager was clearly trying to make up for his earlier mistake, but Jessica could tell it wasn't going to be enough. As she sat back in her chair, the realization hit her. They weren't just treating her differently because of her clothes. It was about the assumptions they made about her. To them, she was just an accessory to her husband's wealth, someone who didn't fit their vision of what the elite should look like. Her simple denim jacket was the perfect symbol of everything they didn't understand, a silent rebellion against the superficial world they lived in. Jessica felt a deep sense of clarity. She had always known she didn't belong in this world of polished facades and hidden judgments, but she had learned to navigate it with grace until now. As she looked around the restaurant, she couldn't ignore the feeling that everyone was waiting for the moment when her husband would arrive and prove their assumptions wrong. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a chair scraping across the floor. She turned, expecting to see the staff approaching to offer another fake apology, but instead it was a new figure, someone she hadn't seen before. The man who had approached her table was tall, with dark skin and a calm yet authoritative presence. His name tag read Darius. Unlike the others, he didn't seem to be sizing her up, and there was no forced politeness in his demeanor. Instead, his eyes met hers with an almost apologetic glance, a hint of understanding behind them. "Mrs. Morrison?" Darius's voice was smooth, but there was a warmth to it that the others lacked. "I've been asked to take over your service this evening. I understand you've been waiting quite a while." Jessica blinked, surprised by the change in tone. "Yes, I've been waiting for quite some time, but it's okay," she said, her voice steady. She was getting used to the awkwardness by now, though the frustration was still simmering beneath the surface. Darius nodded, pulling out the chair opposite her and sitting down with a calmness that made her feel, for the first time tonight, that she wasn't an afterthought. "I just wanted to apologize for the way you've been treated. I know you've probably been getting some attention, and I'm sorry for that." Jessica's eyebrows furrowed in surprise. "You don't have to apologize. It's not your fault." Darius shook his head. "It's not right. No one should feel the way you've been made to feel. I'll make sure you're taken care of for the rest of the evening." His voice held a quiet sincerity that contrasted sharply with the coldness she'd experienced earlier. For the first time that evening, Jessica felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe not all the staff shared the same prejudices. Maybe some of them still had the capacity to see beyond appearances. Jessica's mind raced as the night wore on. Despite Darius's calming presence, the weight of everything that had happened still lingered. She tried to focus on the evening ahead, to forget about the staff's earlier behavior and just enjoy the time with Nicholas. But the tension in the air was palpable. As more patrons filled the restaurant, she found herself growing increasingly aware of the subtle glances, the hushed conversations, and the barely concealed amusement from the staff as they continued to wait for the moment when Nicholas would arrive and prove them wrong. The door swung open, and Jessica's heart skipped a beat. She turned her head just slightly, hoping, praying that it was him. But it wasn't Nicholas. Instead, it was a tall, well-dressed man, walking confidently into the restaurant. His presence was commanding, but he was unfamiliar. Jessica sat back in her chair, her eyes narrowing slightly. She recognized that type, someone who carried an air of authority, someone who belonged here in this world of wealth and status. But there was something in his demeanor that made her pause. As he walked past her table, their eyes met for a brief moment. His gaze lingered just a second too long, and Jessica could almost hear the silent judgment behind his eyes. The man didn't seem to care that she had noticed, but his reaction was enough to make her uncomfortable, and her skin prickled with the all-too-familiar feeling of being an outsider in a world that only valued surface-level perfection. As the man continued on his path, disappearing into the crowd, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that she had just been silently judged once again. The moment lingered in her mind, pulling her focus away from everything else. It wasn't the first time she had felt this way, but it was the first time it had happened so openly, without any effort to hide the contempt. She let out a breath, trying to regain her composure. She didn't belong here, and they made that painfully clear. But tonight she refused to let that fact break her. She turned her attention back to her phone, scrolling through pictures of her and Nicholas's past anniversaries. Despite everything, she felt a connection to the memories. Those quieter, simpler moments when they were just two people who understood each other. Nicholas had always loved her authenticity, even when others tried to place her in a box she didn't fit. As she thought about him, a message popped up on her screen. It was from him again. "I'm so sorry I'm running late. I'll be there as soon as I can." "Hang in there, my love." Jessica smiled softly at the text. She could feel the frustration melting away a bit, replaced with the familiar warmth that came from knowing Nicholas was thinking of her. He didn't care about the judgment from people like the man who had just walked past. He only cared about her. And in that moment, she realized that their love, the strength of their bond, was more than enough to carry her through. It didn't matter what anyone else thought. They were building something real together, something that no judgment or disapproval could ever take away. As Jessica sat in the quiet chaos of the restaurant, the tension began to build. Every glance, every whisper from the staff felt like it was directed at her, their judgment still hanging in the air. But in that moment, as she continued to wait for Nicholas, something in her shifted. The quiet murmurs around her no longer felt as sharp, no longer carried the sting they once did. She realized that while she couldn't control their perceptions, she could control how she reacted to them. She knew Nicholas would arrive soon, and when he did, everything would change. He was the constant in her life, the one person who saw her for who she truly was, who never judged her for the clothes she wore or the life she led before meeting him. Tonight, he wasn't just coming as her husband. He was coming as the person who would finally challenge the narrative the staff had painted of her. As the clock ticked closer to 7 o'clock, Jessica's thoughts wandered to the years they had spent together. How many times had she felt like an outsider in the world of wealth, even though she was married to one of the city's most successful men? How many times had she held her tongue, not out of fear, but out of a quiet, steadfast determination to remain true to herself? Her phone buzzed again, and she didn't hesitate this time. It was a text from Nicholas. "Just parking now, my love." Almost there. The message made her smile. He was so close. She could almost feel the weight of everything about to change. Just as Jessica put her phone down, the door to the restaurant opened again, and this time, she didn't need to check to know it was him. The air in the room seemed to shift, the tension that had been suffocating her melting away as Nicholas entered. His presence was commanding, yet quiet, as always. There was no need for grand gestures, no need for fanfare. Nicholas simply walked in with the same calm confidence that had drawn Jessica to him all those years ago. Heads turned as he made his way across the restaurant, his tailored suit perfectly fitting his broad shoulders. But it wasn't his appearance that made her heart race. It was the way he looked at her when he saw her sitting at the table, the warmth in his eyes that was all hers, and hers alone. As he approached, Jessica stood up, unable to keep the smile from her face. He reached out to kiss her cheek, his voice low and warm as he spoke. "There's my girl," he said softly, his hand resting on her back as he pulled out the chair to sit beside her. "I've been entertained," Jessica replied, her voice light. But there was a hint of something more, something that had been building throughout the night. The staff's earlier behavior, the subtle mockery, had all led to this moment. It wasn't just about the wealth or the power that Nicholas held. It was about the fact that he saw her as an equal, no matter where they were or who was watching. Nicholas noticed the undertone in her words, the slight edge that had crept into her voice. Before he could ask what was wrong, Edward, the general manager, appeared at their table, wearing a nervous smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Morrison," he began, his voice too polite, "we are so honored to have you with us tonight." Jessica watched, almost in amusement, as Edward's tone shifted instantly. The shift wasn't just in his words, but in the way he carried himself, like a man who was suddenly aware of the gravity of his earlier mistakes. As Jessica sat at the table with Nicholas, she could feel the shift in the atmosphere as the staff began to scatter. The once lively murmurs and whispers that filled the room now felt quieter, subdued, almost apologetic. Edward, the general manager, was still hovering nearby, his forced politeness betraying his discomfort. It was as if the whole restaurant had suddenly realized the truth. There was much more to Jessica than the judgment they had cast on her just hours before. Nicholas, sensing the change, squeezed her hand under the table, giving her a reassuring smile. "Everything okay?" he asked softly, his gaze scanning the room as if to take in the subtle shift of energy. Jessica returned the smile, though there was a glimmer of something more in her eyes, a quiet strength that had grown over the course of the evening. "It is now," she said, her voice steady. The evening had taken a turn, and Jessica could feel the weight of it. The staff, once so dismissive, now seemed to be walking on eggshells. She wasn't sure if it was because of the unexpected recognition from Mrs. Abernathy or the realization of who they were really dealing with, but their behavior had shifted from mockery to nervousness. The once cold politeness had turned into something else entirely, a mix of uncertainty and fear. As Edward approached their table again, this time with a visibly forced smile, Jessica noticed that he wasn't alone. The other servers, Marcus, Claire, and Darius, followed behind him, their expressions a strange mixture of guilt and apprehension. Edward cleared his throat, clearly trying to mask the nervousness in his voice. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, once again, we are truly honored to have you here this evening," he said, but his tone had lost its previous arrogance. There was no longer the hint of superiority in his words, just a sense of forced respect. Nicholas raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharp as he looked at each of the servers standing behind Edward. "I trust my wife has been well taken care of tonight?" he asked, his voice calm, but there was an edge to it that made the room go quieter still. Edward shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the servers who stood in a line, clearly dreading what was coming next. "Yes, of course, sir," Edward stammered. "We've done everything to ensure she's comfortable." Nicholas turned his attention to the servers, his eyes meeting each of theirs. "I'm sure you've been doing your best," he said, his tone still even. "But I have to ask, was my wife treated with the same respect you'd show a regular guest?" There was a long pause. The servers shifted uncomfortably, exchanging furtive glances. Marcus, the young man with slick-back hair, seemed to squirm under Nicholas's gaze, while Claire, the blonde hostess, refused to meet anyone's eye. Darius, the waiter who had been the most apologetic toward Jessica, gave her a brief glance before looking down at the floor. Jessica sat quietly, watching the exchange, feeling a mix of power and discomfort. It wasn't about humiliating them. She didn't want revenge, but she couldn't ignore what had happened. Nicholas was simply giving them a chance to face their mistakes, and the tension was thick enough to slice. As the tension in the room reached its peak, the silence hung heavy, but Jessica remained calm, her eyes fixed on Nicholas. He had asked the question. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The staff stood in front of them, visibly uncomfortable, waiting for the inevitable consequences of their earlier actions. Nicholas didn't raise his voice, didn't demand anything. His quiet confidence was enough. The look in his eyes, a mixture of disappointment and authority, said it all. He wasn't angry. He was disappointed in their behavior, in the way they had judged Jessica. He had seen it before, the way people made assumptions based on appearances, how easily they dismissed others without understanding who they truly were. Tonight was no different, but the stakes were higher now. They had mocked his wife, and it was time to face the consequences. The moment stretched, and Jessica could feel the weight of it. It wasn't just about the servers or the manager anymore. It was about all the times in her life when she had been underestimated, overlooked, or misjudged. She had fought against it for so long, but this was different. This time the world around her was being forced to see her for who she was, not the wife of a billionaire or the woman in the denim jacket, but Jessica Morrison, someone who had earned every part of her life, every moment of happiness. Edward finally broke the silence. "Mrs. Morrison, Mr. Morrison, I am so sorry for the way you've been treated tonight," he said, his voice cracking with the weight of his apology. "This behavior was completely unacceptable, and I take full responsibility. It won't happen again." Nicholas nodded, his expression softening slightly, though his gaze remained unwavering. "I believe you," he said simply, then turned to Jessica. "What do you think, my love?" Jessica took a slow, steady breath, the weight of the moment settling into her chest. She could feel the eyes of the entire restaurant on her, waiting for her response. It was tempting to demand that they all be fired, to make a scene, to let her anger fuel her actions. But instead, she took a deep breath and turned to Nicholas, her heart full of the same quiet strength she had carried with her all evening. I think, I think it's important that they learn from this, she said softly, her voice calm but firm. Not just for tonight, but for every time they've looked at someone and decided they didn't belong. Nicholas's eyes flickered with pride, and he squeezed her hand. I agree, he said, his voice warm. He turned to the staff, his tone shifting to something more authoritative. Tonight's behavior will have consequences. But Jessica is right. The real lesson here is understanding what it means to truly see people, not just as they appear, but for who they are. He paused, letting his words sink in before he continued. Jessica doesn't need your pity, your apology. She's never needed it. But you will respect her from now on, just as you would any other guest in this restaurant. That's the only way forward. Edward nodded, visibly relieved that the storm had passed, but his expression remained one of genuine remorse. Of course, Mr. Morrison, he said. We'll make sure this never happens again. As the tension began to lift, the restaurant resumed its usual rhythm. The staff quickly adjusted, moving with a more careful precision, though the shift in their demeanor was unmistakable. The whispers had stopped, replaced with polite conversation. Jessica could feel the eyes on her, but this time they weren't filled with judgment. They were filled with respect. Nicholas turned back to her, his expression softer now, and for a moment, the weight of the evening lifted. You handled that better than I ever could have, he said with a smile. I'm proud of you. Jessica smiled back, her heart light. It wasn't about handling it, Nicholas. It was about standing my ground. She reached into her bag and pulled out the small gift box she had been holding onto all evening. Happy anniversary, she said softly, her voice full of affection. Nicholas's eyes softened as he opened the box to reveal the vintage watch, its coordinates engraved on the back, the very spot where they had first met. It's perfect, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Just like you. As the night went on, the once cold, judgmental atmosphere of Lumiere had transformed. Jessica and Nicholas enjoyed the rest of their meal, savoring each bite, each conversation, and the quiet moment of peace they had fought for. And as they left the restaurant, hand in hand, the lesson was clear. True worth was never about appearance, wealth, or status. It was about authenticity, kindness, and the courage to stand up for who you really were, no matter how the world tried to define you.